The autumn light over Georgian Bay was doing something extraordinary that evening, turning the water into hammered copper, the kind of light my brother Thomas used to call God showing off. For the first time in 7 months, standing at the kitchen window of my house in Collingwood, I felt something loosen in my chest. Something that had been clenched tight since the morning I got the call that Thomas was gone. 63 years old, and I was learning all over again what it felt like to breathe. My son had been so good through all of it. Through the diagnosis, through the hospital visits to Toronto, through the funeral arrangements and the weeks of paperwork that follow a death the way shadows follow a person. Daniel had driven up from Hamilton every single weekend. He had sat beside me at the lawyer's office. He had held my hand when I cried. I kept thinking how lucky I was, how, after everything Marcus and I had been through with him in his 20s, he had become exactly the kind of man a mother prays for. I was still thinking that when I walked down the hallway toward the kitchen to refill my tea and heard his voice coming from the back porch. The sliding door was open 2 inches. Just enough. "She has no idea how much it actually is," he was saying. "Thomas didn't have kids. There's no one else. It all goes to her." A pause. His wife Kristen must have said something. $2.4 million, Daniel said, plus the cottage property in Muskoka. The lawyer said the land alone is worth another $600,000. Easy. I stood completely still in the hallway. The floorboard under my left foot was the one that creaked. I had known that for 22 years, so I did not move. "She's 63, Chris. She's healthy. We could be waiting 15, 20 years. That's not a plan." Another pause. I know. But there are ways to speed things up without. No, I'm not talking about that. I mean legally. Kristen, listen to me. Remember what your cousin went through with her father-in-law in Oakville? The capacity assessment? Mom's been on antidepressants since Thomas died. Grief does things to people. If we got the right doctor involved, someone who does these evaluations, we could argue she's not managing her finances properly. She gave $40,000 to that hospice charity last month. $40,000. That alone. I walked back to the living room. I sat down in the armchair by the fireplace, Thomas's chair, the one I hadn't moved since he used to sit in it during Christmas visits, and I put my hands flat on my knees and I breathed. "My son, me, Daniel. I want to be honest with you about what happened in those first few minutes, because I think it matters. I did not cry. I did not feel rage. Not right away. What I felt was something much colder and much more specific. I realized I had been watching a performance for 7 months. Every drive up from Hamilton, every hand held, every cup of tea made without being asked. I had thought I was witnessing my son's love for me. I was watching an audition. I was also, somewhere underneath that cold feeling, terrified. Because I knew enough about guardianship and capacity law in Ontario to know that what he was describing was not impossible. I had a close friend, Patricia, whose mother had been put under a financial management order 3 years ago by her own children, based on a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment. Patricia's mother had been sharp as a tack, sharp enough to know what was happening, not sharp enough, legally, to stop it. I was on antidepressants. I had made a large charitable donation. I was a widow. Marcus had died 6 years ago, living alone in a 4-bedroom house, and my only child had a wife who worked in estate law. Kristen worked in estate law. I had always liked Kristen. I sat in Thomas's chair until I heard the porch door slide open, and then I picked up the book on the side table and opened it to a random page, and when Daniel came into the living room, I was reading about the migratory patterns of Arctic birds, and I looked up and smiled. "More tea?" I said. He made it for me. He was very attentive that evening. I watched his face while he talked about his work, about a renovation they were planning for the Hamilton house, about a trip to Portugal they were considering in the spring. I nodded. I laughed at the right moments. I had spent 30 years as a high school vice principal. I knew how to keep my face arranged while my mind was doing something entirely different. That night, after they went to bed in the guest room, I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and I wrote down every word I could remember. The next morning I made pancakes and I hugged them both goodbye, and I waved from the front step until their car disappeared around the bend on Mountain Road. Then I went inside, locked the door, and called my brother's lawyer. Gordon Ashworth had handled Thomas's estate, and before that he had handled our parents' affairs, and before that he had been my father's squash partner at the Collingwood Club for 30 years. He was 71, and he was not warm on the phone, but he was precise, and right now, precise was what I needed. I told him what I had heard. All of it. He was quiet for a moment. "Margaret," he said, "I want you to do 3 things before we speak again. First, write everything down in detail and date it and email it to me today. Second, do not discuss the estate, the inheritance, or your finances with Daniel or Kristen under any circumstances. Third, and I cannot stress this enough, get a capacity assessment done proactively by a neuropsychologist of your own choosing before anyone else can initiate one, so that if they try, so that there is already a clean, independent assessment on record from a doctor you selected, showing full cognitive and financial capacity. It doesn't prevent them from trying. It makes the attempt look exactly like what it is." I wrote down the name he gave me. Dr. Sylvia Okafor, neuropsychologist, practice in Barrie. "One more thing," Gordon said. "Your phone." "What about it?" "Kristen works in estate law. I'm not suggesting anything, but I would ask yourself whether anyone has had access to your phone in the last few months, either physically or through an app you may have downloaded. I thought about Christmas. Daniel had set up a new phone for me, a birthday gift, he'd said. The old one was so slow. He had transferred everything over himself. I had sat in the kitchen eating shortbread while he did it. "I'll call you back," I said. I drove to the Staples in Collingwood and bought a new prepaid phone with cash. I put my old phone in the kitchen drawer and I left it there. 3 days later, Dr. Okafor's office was in a low beige building on Bayfield Street, next to a physiotherapy clinic, and the waiting room smelled like coffee and new carpet. She was a small woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she shook my hand with both of hers. The assessment took 2.5 hours. Verbal memory, processing speed, executive function, financial reasoning tasks, a long clinical interview. "You're in the top quartile for your age group," she told me afterward, in her office with the door closed, across every category. "I need that in writing," I said. "I assumed you would," she said. "I'll have the full report to your lawyer by Friday." I drove home through the October countryside, the maples doing their annual extravagant dyeing, and I made one more call, to my niece. Rebecca was Thomas's daughter from his first marriage, the one that ended before I was old enough to really understand what had happened. She was 38, and lived in Ottawa, and worked as an investigator for the federal government, and she had always been, as Thomas used to say, the one in the family who asked the right questions. She was also, as of Thomas's will, co-executor of the estate alongside Gordon, a provision Thomas had added in the final revision 3 weeks before he died that I had not fully understood until now. "I need to talk to you about something," I said. "Not on this phone. Can you drive to Collingwood this weekend?" "I'll be there Saturday morning," she said. She didn't ask why. Rebecca arrived with a bag of bagels from a place she liked in Ottawa, and we sat at the kitchen table and I told her everything. She listened the way Thomas used to listen, completely still, not interrupting, her eyes on my face. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "The phone he set up for you," she said. "Have you had anyone look at it?" "Not yet." She took it out of the kitchen drawer with a cloth she had thought to bring disposable gloves, which told me something about how seriously she was taking this, and she examined it carefully. Then she made a call to someone whose name she didn't share with me, and 40 minutes later she showed me the screen. There was a monitoring application running in the background. It had been installed on the same day Daniel set up the phone. It had access to calls, texts, email, and location data. I sat with that for a moment. My son had been reading my emails. He had known for months everything I discussed with Gordon about the estate. Everything I had written to friends about how I was coping. Every text message, every appointment. He knew I was going to Gordon's office last month, I said. "Yes," Rebecca said. "He called that afternoon asking if I wanted to have lunch. I thought it was spontaneous. He was checking what you knew." I looked at the phone in its little glove-protected isolation on my kitchen table, and I felt finally the thing I had been keeping at a distance since that evening on the porch. Not rage exactly. Something quieter and more permanent than rage. Grief, I think, for the son I thought I had. Rebecca documented everything with photographs before we put the phone back in the drawer. Gordon, when we called him together from the prepaid phone, told us to leave it exactly where it was. Let them keep thinking it's working, he said. That's information we can use. Over the following 3 weeks, I was very careful. I responded to Daniel's texts with the warmth of a mother who suspected nothing. I accepted his invitation to come to Hamilton for Thanksgiving, and I sat at his table and I passed the stuffing, and I listened to Kristen talk about a case she was working on. The irony was almost physical, and I drove home, alone on the 400 with the radio off. During those 3 weeks, Gordon was not idle. He had filed to have the estate formally distributed on an expedited schedule, citing the completeness of probate documentation and Thomas's clear testamentary intentions. This was unusual but not unprecedented in Ontario, and Gordon knew the right judge. He also connected me with a litigation lawyer named Christine Park, who had her office in Toronto and a reputation in elder law that Daniel, had he known about her, would have found instructive. They haven't made a move yet, Christine told me during our first call. They're waiting for the inheritance to be fully transferred before they initiate anything. That's when a capacity proceeding would be most useful to them, when there's a specific, substantial asset they can argue you're mismanaging. So the timing. Exactly. We want the transfer to complete, but we want everything else already in place before it does. The neuropsych report, the updated estate documents, and if possible, the evidence from the phone. The evidence from the phone required one more step. Gordon suggested I have a conversation on my compromised phone about a specific financial decision, something large enough to look relevant, something that could be used. I chose a Thursday evening. I called Patricia, who knew the whole situation by now, and who had her own history with this particular kind of betrayal, and I told her, on the old phone, that I was thinking of restructuring how the inheritance was held. That I'd spoken to a different financial advisor, someone in Barrie, who had recommended putting a large portion into a specific type of investment I named. I described being confused about some of the paperwork. I said I wasn't sure I understood it completely, but the returns sounded very good. Daniel called the next morning. He was subtle about it. He asked how I was sleeping, whether I'd been getting out of the house, whether I'd thought any more about that financial management software he'd mentioned something to help me track everything. He said, now that there was more to keep track of. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that Kristen knew a very good financial planner, completely trustworthy, someone who worked with a lot of women in my situation. Women in my situation, I said. You know what I mean, Mom. On their own. Managing things alone. That's very thoughtful, I said. Let me think about it. Christine recorded the call from her end, with my consent, which is legal in Ontario when one party to the call consents. Combined with the monitoring app documentation, the original Overheard conversation that I had written down and submitted to Gordon within 24 hours, and a financial record showing that every decision I had made in the past 7 months was consistent with sound and clearly documented reasoning, we had what Christine called a comprehensive picture. A picture of what? I asked. Of a pattern of behavior, she said, designed to position you as financially vulnerable in preparation for a legal intervention. That's not just an estate dispute, Margaret. That's elder financial abuse, under Ontario law. I had not let myself use that phrase yet. Hearing it from Christine in her measured Bay Street diction made it real in a way my own internal voice had been avoiding. My son, the estate transfer completed on a Wednesday in late November. Gordon called me at 8 in the morning. The funds, $2.4 million, after taxes and legal fees, were in the trust account he had established. The Muskoka property transfer was processing and would complete within the week. Daniel called me at 9:15 that same morning. He wanted to come up to Collingwood that weekend, he said. Just the two of them, he and Kristen, to celebrate and to talk about next steps. He used that phrase, next steps. Of course, I said. I'll make your room up. He never came. Christine filed the elder financial abuse documentation with the Ontario government on the Thursday. An application for a restraining order against Daniel and Kristen, on the grounds of demonstrated intent to exploit, was filed simultaneously. Gordon executed a new estate protection instrument that effectively required independent third-party approval Christine's firm for any significant financial transactions for a period of 18 months, as a protective measure that I had requested. And Rebecca, as co-executor, filed a formal complaint with the Law Society of Ontario regarding Kristen's conduct, given her professional obligations as a member of the bar. Daniel called me 4 times on Friday. I did not answer. I let Gordon's office handle the communication. The letter his own lawyer sent, 2 weeks later, was an attempt to frame everything as a misunderstanding, a son concerned about his aging mother, an expression of love that had been misconstrued. The monitoring application, they claimed, had been installed for my protection, as a way of ensuring I could be located in case of emergency. Christine's response was 11 pages long. I did not read all of it. I read the first paragraph and the last. In January, after mediation failed because Christine refused to mediate anything involving documented intent to exploit, the matter was heard before a judge in Toronto. I sat in the second row with Rebecca on one side and Patricia on the other, and I watched my son sit at a table across a courtroom from me and not look in my direction. The judge took 4 days to issue her ruling. Every protection measure was upheld. The financial documentation went on record. Kristen received a formal reprimand from the Law Society, which is a matter of public record in Ontario. The restraining order was not granted in its original form. The judge found the threshold for that specific instrument was not quite met, but a no-contact order regarding my finances was issued, and it accomplished the same thing. Daniel did not contest it. I drove back to Collingwood in February, through a snowfall that softened everything, the fields, the tree lines, the long gray stretch of Highway 26, into something almost peaceful. Rebecca had offered to drive me, but I wanted to be alone for this part. I needed an hour with nobody's feelings but my own. I thought about the boy Daniel had been, the one who used to sit on the dock at my parents' place on the Severn River and ask me questions about everything: why the sky was that color at dusk, what happened to people after they died, whether a person could be 2 things at once. I had loved that boy completely. I still did, in the way you love something that no longer exists in the form you knew it. That's the part nobody tells you about betrayal inside a family. It isn't one loss. It's a series of them, arriving slowly. The relationship you thought you had, the history you thought was shared, the future you had quietly been imagining. You don't grieve them all at once. You grieve them as you find them. I pulled into my driveway as the snow was letting up. The Georgian Bay was invisible in the white, but I knew it was there. I had known it was there for 22 years. Inside, I made tea. I sat in Thomas's chair. I looked at the trust documents on the table, the real ones, the protected ones, the ones that meant what had been built could not be easily dismantled. A few weeks later, Rebecca came for a long weekend, and we went through some of Thomas's things that had been shipped from his house in Guelph. Books, mostly. His old field guides to Ontario birds, a photograph of the 3 of us, Thomas and me, and our mother at a fair in Owen Sound sometime in the late 1970s. I am maybe 7 years old in it. Thomas is 11. We are both laughing at something outside the frame. I put it on the mantel. Daniel has not contacted me. I do not know if he ever will. I have thought carefully about what I would say if he did, and I have not arrived at an answer I am fully satisfied with, and I think that is honest. Some questions don't resolve cleanly. Some doors you leave neither locked nor open, just closed, because that is the only truthful position you can hold. What I know is this. I am 60, 3 years old, and I am in the top quartile for my age group across every category, and the Bay is still there every morning when I open the curtains, doing its ordinary, extraordinary work. Thomas would have found the whole thing almost funny, I think. He would have said something precise and a little dark, and then he would have made me tea, and that would have been enough. I raise my glass to him sometimes, in the evenings, to the life he built and the one I am still building. To Rebecca, who asked the right questions. To Gordon, who knew exactly which documents to file. To Christine, who said the word I had been avoiding out loud, because sometimes a thing needs to be named before you can do anything about it. And to myself, I suppose. For standing still in that hallway. For not letting the creak in the floorboard give me away.